Hi, my name is Sarah Axelson, and I'm currently interning at Topsail High School with the Student Services Department. Something I'm very passionate about is supporting students who belong to the LGBTQIA community. So the purpose of this presentation is to help you learn more about these students, learn about gender identity, sexuality, and specific ways you can support these students in the school building. This presentation contains a lot of information about how we can support students who belong to the LGBTQIA community, but there are 6 specific learning objectives that will be covered. First of all, you'll be able to define the acronym LGBTQIA+. Secondly, you'll be able to describe the difference between gender identity and gender expression. Third, you'll be able to define different gender identities. Fourth, you will be able to define different sexual orientations. Fifth, you will understand why addressing gender identity and sexuality is important. And lastly, you will be able to describe strategies for supporting individuals who belong to the LGBTQIA+ community. You've most likely heard the acronym LGBTQIA+ before, or maybe just LGBT or LGBTQ. It's okay if you don't know the entire acronym, but I want you to think about what you do know about the LGBTQIA+ community and what these letters stand for. Take a moment and think about it, and then we're going to talk about it. Do you have your answers? Let's move on. The LGBT portion of the acronym is the portion most people are usually aware of, but the entire acronym includes individuals who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and individuals who have any gender identities or sexual orientations other than cisgender or heterosexual. As we begin to dive deeper into understanding more about LGBTQIA+ individuals, we need to know the difference between sex, gender identity, and gender expression. Sometimes people think these terms are interchangeable, but they're actually not. So I want you to think about your own understanding of these terms before we move on. Let's talk for a minute about the difference between sex, gender identity, and gender expression. An individual's sex is assigned at birth based solely upon their sex organs. Someone's gender identity is an internal, deeply held sense of self that may align with their gender that they were assigned at birth, or it may not. Gender identity develops throughout the course of a person's life, and it can change over time. Gender expression is the visible manifestation of gender. Individuals express gender through their name, pronouns, clothing, haircuts, voice, visible body characteristics, etc. Society as a whole tends to make assumptions about individuals based on their gender expression and what we can see. Especially in the South, we tend to say sir or ma'am when addressing people to be polite. How do we determine which way to address someone? We use the context clues of how they present themselves, their visible characteristics, combined with our own understanding of what it means to be masculine and feminine. If someone appears to be more feminine, we'll likely use ma'am, and if someone appears more masculine, we'll likely use sir when addressing them. However, someone's gender identity and gender expression do not always match. It's important that we don't make assumptions about someone's gender identity. When we misgender someone, for example, if we refer to someone as sir and they really they're female or they identify as female, we increase the gender dysphoria, which is the stress that's created when they are aware that their gender identity does not align with the gender they were assigned at birth. And we don't want to increase that stress for these individuals. Let's dig a little deeper into gender identity. If I were to ask how many genders there are, the most common response would be 2, male and female. However, gender is not binary and it's not black and white. It exists on a spectrum. A cisgender individual is someone whose gender identity matches the gender they were assigned at birth. So their gender identity matches their sex organs. I identify as male, I have the male parts. I identify as female, I have the female parts. And then they're known as cisgender. A gender nonconforming or non-binary individual is someone whose gender does not align with male or female. Someone who labels themselves as gender fluid or gender queer likely expresses their gender as more feminine on some occasions and more masculine on other occasions. They're very fluid. They understand the fluidity of gender. Sometimes they feel more masculine, sometimes they feel more feminine, and that's okay. An intersex individual is anatomically misaligned with the typical definitions of male or female. Someone who's intersex may identify as intersex, or they may have another gender identity. I personally haven't come into contact with intersex individuals, at least to my knowledge, so I'm not super aware about this particular gender identity, but it does exist. Transgender individuals usually have a gender identity that is the opposite of their assigned gender based on their sex at birth. Some people may socially transition where they use names, pronouns, and clothing that aligns with their gender identity, and others can physically transition so that their voice, body hair, and physical appearance will more closely align with their gender identity. So if an individual was born male, but their gender identity is female, they may just start dressing more feminine so that others kind of see them as female, or they may actually get surgeries in order to help them physically transition into that gender identity. Let's talk about pronouns. Generally speaking, individuals whose gender identity is male will use he, him, his pronouns. Females will use she, her, hers, and gender nonconforming or non-binary individuals tend to use they, them, or their pronouns. Some gender nonconforming or non-binary individuals may use a combination of she, they, he, they, or he, she, they pronouns. We should never make assumptions about an individual's gender identity or pronouns. However, we can pay attention to how individuals refer to themselves. When in doubt, we can respectfully ask how an individual would like to be addressed. So this goes back to making assumptions based on their gender expression. So if an individual appears more masculine, we might think that they use he, him, his, and we would use those words to talk about that person, but maybe that's not aligned with their gender identity. So we need to be careful to not increase gender dysphoria and to be respectful of how individuals see themselves. Let's test our knowledge and have a quick recap on different gender identities and pronoun usage. Someone who is born male and uses she, her, hers pronouns is most likely transgender. Someone who is born male and uses they, them, their pronouns is most likely gender nonconforming, non-binary, genderqueer, or gender fluid. And then someone who is born female and uses she, her, hers pronouns is most likely cisgender. Again, we should not make assumptions, but these are guidelines we can use when trying to have a better understanding of gender identity and pronoun usage. All right, now we're going to move on from gender identity and expression to an understanding of sexual orientation. I want you to think about what your definition of sexual orientation is, and then list either out loud on your notebook or maybe just in your mind all the different sexual orientations that you are aware of. And then we're going to talk about some of them together. I'll give you a few seconds to collect your thoughts before we move on. Do you have some ideas? All right, let's keep going. As I mentioned before, sexual orientation and gender identity are often confused, but they are not the same thing. Sexual orientation refers to the emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction someone has to others based either on gender expression, gender identity, or sex. While students are more likely to disclose gender identity so that others will refer to them with the appropriate pronouns, we are going to briefly discuss some different sexual orientations that you may encounter when working with students or staff in the building. Asexual, or ace, refers to someone who experiences little to no sexual attraction but doesn't feel the need to act on that attraction in a sexual way. Bisexual, or bi, refers to someone who's attracted to those of their own gender and those of a different gender. Sometimes bisexual is used as an umbrella term to describe individuals who are just simply attracted to more than one gender. The term gay is used to describe someone who's attracted to those of their same gender. It's more commonly used to describe men who are attracted to men, but it can be used to describe women who are attracted to women. More commonly, women who are attracted to women describe themselves as lesbian. Queer is a general term used to describe anyone who is not heterosexual or cisgender. So we talked about that earlier. So heterosexual is when you're attracted to someone of the opposite sex. That's kind of the norm in society. And then cisgender is when your gender identity matches your sex at birth. So that's also kind of the norm. So anyone who doesn't fit into those categories can be considered queer if they describe themselves that way. Pansexual, or pan, refers to someone who's attracted to people of any or all genders. This is sometimes used to describe individuals who are attracted to more than one gender, so it's closely related to the term bisexual or bi. Straight or heterosexual refers to men who are attracted to women or women who are attracted to men. Alrighty, on a scrap sheet of paper, I want you to try to match the definitions to the sexual orientations. So a male who is attracted to females. Think about the options and what term goes with that definition. And then a female who is attracted to females. A male who is attracted to males. Someone who is not heterosexual or cisgender. someone who experiences little to no sexual attraction, someone who is attracted to individuals of their gender and the opposite gender, and then someone who's attracted to all genders. Let's see if you got it right. All right, your paper should maybe look something like this if you drew out lines, or maybe you just wrote the term next to the definitions. I'll read them out for you. A male who's attracted to females can be labeled as straight. A female who's attracted to females can be labeled as lesbian, or sometimes gay, like we talked about. A male who's attracted to males can be labeled as gay. Someone who is not heterosexual or cisgender can be labeled as queer. Someone who experiences little to no sexual attraction can be labeled as asexual. Someone who's attracted to individuals of their gender and the opposite gender can be labeled as bisexual. And someone who's attracted to all genders can be labeled as pansexual. How many did you get right? All right, we've gone through a lot of information, so now we need to stop and ask ourselves, why does it matter? Now I know about gender identity and gender expression and different sexual orientations, but what does it matter to me? Although your personal beliefs may not necessarily support students from the LGBTQIA+ community, it is crucial that we show unconditional support for our students. They're in a peak time of their lives when they're navigating their identity development and the development of their gender identities or sexual orientations, and they need to feel supported. All right, we're going to look at some statistics related to LGBTQIA+ individuals, and as we go through, I want you to think to yourself if any of these statistics are surprising to you. 75.1% of transgender students feel unsafe at school because of their gender expression. Only 26% of LGBTQ youth always feel safe at school. 5% of LGBTQ youth feel that all of their teachers and staff are supportive of LGBTQ people. 41% of transgender or gender nonconforming people have attempted suicide. Transgender teens are almost 6 times more likely to attempt suicide than their non-transgender peers. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual teens are more than 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers. Roughly 1/3 of homeless youth identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or questioning. About 4% of homeless youth identify as transgender, compared with 1% of the general youth population. So let those statistics sink in. The one that was the most surprising to me is that 5% of LGBTQ youth feel that all of their teachers and staff are supportive of LGBTQ people. That means that these students, only 5% of these students feel that everyone that is an adult in their life that is in a role of power as a teacher or administrator, or just anyone in the school building, only 5% of them feel supported by everyone in that building. That's not a great statistic. Here's some more statistics about why it's important for us to be knowledgeable about gender identity and sexual orientation. Some LGBTQ students of color are at an even higher risk of suicide than other LGBTQ subgroups. Latinx and Native Pacific Islander LGBTQ youth have a significantly higher prevalence of suicide attempts. In 2017, Black people comprised 60% of the victims of LGBTQ hate-related homicides. Students who face harassment are less likely to succeed academically. I think we know that. Bias-based harassment also increases the risk for problems like school absences, substance use, and emotional distress. Students who experience higher levels of victimization based on gender expression are twice as likely to report that they do not plan to pursue post-secondary education. Creating school environments that respect and affirm gender diversity will empower all students. So I think it's important to note that LGBTQIA+ students who are also racial minorities face an even greater risk because the multiple components of their identities intersect, and they are racial minorities and also minorities in regards to either gender identity or sexual orientation, and so they face greater risk. And we need to make sure we're supporting those students a little bit extra. Generally speaking, I don't know if this is true for our school, but generally speaking, in the school setting, students who are members of the LGBTQIA+ community have experienced a lack of support from school staff. Almost 2/3 of LGBTQ students who had reported an incident of harassment or assault said that school staff did nothing in response or told them to ignore it. The 2 most common reasons given for not reporting harassment or assault to school staff were doubts that the staff would effectively address the situation and fears that reporting it would make the situation worse. 1/10 of victimized students said that school staff members were part of the harassment or assault that they were experiencing. This leaves students feeling that there is no recourse for addressing incidents of victimization at their school. Based on these statistics, it's very likely that LGBTQIA+ students have experienced harassment or assault and never reported it, or they reported it and it didn't help their situation, so now they're keeping quiet. These statistics that we've just discussed show why it's important for us to be knowledgeable about gender identity and sexual orientation and the need for us to support these students. We're going to dive now into some specific ways that we can support students who belong to the LGBTQIA+ community. It's very important for us to create a safe space in our classrooms and in our schools in general, because students might not feel safe at home and they need to have somewhere where they feel like they can be themselves. So part of that involves avoiding addressing individuals with gender-specific terms unless you know their gender identity and preferred pronouns. Instead of ma'am or sir, ladies and gentlemen, or she or he, we can use gender-neutral terms. So we could state the student's name in place of she or he, or we could say, how y'all doing, because we're in the South, so y'all is a very common thing that doesn't include specific gender association. We also need to use proper terminology when talking to or about diverse individuals. Gender identities and sexualities are adjectives, not nouns. You would say he or she is or they are transgender. You would not say he or she is a transgender or they are a transgender. You would not say he or she is a gay. You would say he or she is gay. So make sure we're using them as adjectives and not nouns. Include your pronouns in your email signatures or somewhere that your students can see so they know that you acknowledge that gender exists on a spectrum and there's more than one right gender. This will increase their sense of safety and make it more likely they'll trust you with this part of their identity. We also need to provide a space and a time for students to share their pronouns with you, like maybe a questionnaire at the beginning of the semester, as well as the pronouns they use with their families and others. So just having a nice get to know you questionnaire, not in front of the whole class, but a private thing where they can confide in you their pronouns, so that we're making sure that we're not forcing them out in front of students. We need to also make sure we don't out them to their parents. And so with pronouns, sometimes students would be okay in school if you use the pronouns that they desire, and then maybe when you're talking to their families about them, there's a different pronoun that is expected. So make sure you're just aware of that so we're not outing students. We also need to balance the line between keeping our colleagues informed about student needs and respecting students' privacy. So if a student chooses to disclose his, her, or their pronouns to you, we don't need to go share that with everybody, but we do need to make sure that we are helping our team members and other staff be intentional about respecting the fact that there are different gender identities and different pronoun usage in the school. If you make a mistake and you misgender a student, quickly correct yourself without drawing unnecessary attention, and then take a moment to apologize in private. So if a student tells you that their pronouns are they, them, theirs, but instead you accidentally use she or her or hers, quickly correct it. Don't draw unnecessary attention because that'll make the situation worse. We also can integrate course materials whenever possible that provide representation of individuals who are not cisgender or heterosexual. That might upset some parents, but I think that we need to be inclusive, not just of racial identities, but also gender identities and different sexual orientations. Advocate for students by immediately shutting down any hateful speech surrounding LGBTQIA+ individuals. Just like you would shut down any hate speech, most likely, that sounds racist or that is discriminating against people of different races or religions, we also need to do that for the LGBTQIA+ community. And also, I think most importantly, we need to always just keep an open mind and be willing to support our students. You most likely want to, or you probably won't have watched this presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation. I hope that you've learned something from it. I hope that you will apply these different strategies for supporting LGBTQIA+ students. If you want to learn more, here's my references that I used to put together this presentation. And you can also contact me if you desire. I'm not the most knowledgeable person in the world, but this is something I'm very passionate about, and I would be glad to talk to you about more. Thank you.